Okay, so welcome to History of Crime in Scarsdale. The program said early 1900s. I actually am going to be starting in the mid to late 1800s and going up to about 1910. Still admitting people here. I'm Dan Glauber, the local history librarian at the Scarsdale Public Library. Welcome to my presentation on the history of Scarsdale, the history of crime in Scarsdale, 1850 to 1910. Most of my resources for my research were the Scarsdale Inquirer, which is digitized. You can reach that from it's digitized 1901 through 1977. And thanks in part to the Scarsdale Historical Society. Give them a shout out for helping us get that digitized. I also used the New York Times article archive, as well as the Library of Congress newspaper collection online. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Oh, and if you have any questions, you can speak up, or if it's not, if you'd prefer, just put it in the chat and we can have a discussion afterwards as well. Okay. All right. One second, because I'm not seeing my presentation the way I want to. Okay, presenter view. There we go. All right. So let's just jump right in. So the first really interesting crime that I came across involved two pretty well-known families from the area. This was actually in the Tuckahoe area, so close to Scarsdale. Theron Merritt and Eliza Leggett. This was a murder-suicide in 1878. Theron Merritt was the first cousin of Schuyler Merritt, the namesake of the Merritt Parkway, Congressman of Connecticut. He was a paymaster on a steamship, Kansas, during the Civil War, but he was kind of a failure in business. And he'd had typhoid fever and suffered from sunstrokes recently. And nearby, connected by family, was connected by marriage, was Anne Eliza Leggett. So they were related, but through marriage. She was the daughter of George Pollen and Melinda Rood, and had been married to Samuel Leggett Jr., who in 1873 had mysteriously been found dead from what was supposed to be a self-inflicted bullet wound after some business failings. So that's been considered a suicide. And she inherited a lot of wealth from her father. This was after her husband died that she inherited that money. So just to give you an idea here of where we're talking about, you can see on this map the Merritt house here, and Judge Burwell, who was, where are my notes? I minimized my notes and now I don't know how to get them back up. Open speaker notes. Theron Merritt's father-in-law, right? So he was married to the daughter of Judge Burwell. I couldn't find the Leggett household on this map, but there's a description in one of the articles that we'll get to about it. So around 3 p.m. on March, what was it? let me just jump ahead here to get the date. March 15th, I think. Theron Merritt approaches the Leggett cottage, and outside the coachman is waiting. Mrs. Leggett and her daughters, Linda and Mary, were getting ready to go to a sewing society meeting. So Theron says he's going to shoot Mrs. Leggett, who then runs into the house. Mary, one of her daughters, goes to the Merritt house to get help. That's Theron Merritt's house, where he lived with his parents. And Linda tries to keep him from entering the house. The coachman is never called upon to help. And from the articles, he says he wasn't sure what was happening and he wasn't sure what he should do. It also doesn't indicate if the coachman was Black. So maybe if he was, he felt like, for whatever reason, he shouldn't get involved in it. Either way, he obviously felt he shouldn't get involved. So Mrs. Leggett and her daughter enter the house and close and lock the inner door. Theron enters the vestibule and bangs on the inner door, and then he shoots through the door, which has some glass partitions, and hits Mrs. Leggett in the eye, killing her. And then as he leaves, he tells the coachman to get a doctor. So on his way back to his house, he passes Mary, who had been going to get help, and he says to her, "What are you so flurried for? You needn't be alarmed. Your mother is dead. I shot her." So then he enters his father's house where he was living, passes his mother in the kitchen, goes into the parlor, and she follows him. His mother follows him in there just in time to see him shoot himself in the chest. And so there's the suicide part of the murder-suicide. So there were rumors about what was going on here. According to the New York Times, it was an unexplainable bout of insanity. There was no reason this could have happened. But if you go to some of the other less, some of the more yellow papers, they report on frequent visits between the two, excited conversations on the train. They were seen arguing on the train the day before the murder. So there was speculation about whether she had been lending him money, whether they had been having an affair. And then there were also, in some of these papers, they talked about the idea, they kind of hinted at maybe Mrs. Leggett's husband, who had died about 5 years earlier from the self-inflicted gunshot wound, had been actually laying in wait to catch a lover, perhaps Theron, and had either been killed by someone or he committed suicide. Obviously, this is all speculation, but you can see here from the New York Times, a Westchester tragedy, a motiveless murder and suicide. And both of the families said they had no idea what was going on. But you can see from the Sun here, there was supposedly a conversation between Theron's mother and Mrs. Leggett, in which the former, Theron's mother, said to her, "You may do what you please, Mrs. Leggett, but you shall not ruin my boy." The reply to which was, "I will do what I please." And then there's this description here of the incident on the train the day before, where they're arguing, and then he gets off the train, they get off the train, and he follows her in his buggy close behind all the way back to her house, and then continues back to his own house. And then that's the last time that they saw each other. The next day, he kills her. So that's that story. So that's it's the earliest one that I found, and pretty sensational. So good to get off with kick off with a bang. So the next thing that I came across was Charles Mcnulty, who was a foreman on Charles Butler's farm. In 1881, he had hired a farmhand named John West, a Swede, as he's described, who was quarrelsome, liked to drink, and he'd been let go before, but they needed work, they needed help, so they hired him again, and he was told not to smoke in the cow building and proceeded to spit in the milk pail. And so he was let go. And as he left, he said, "I'll have your life within 24 hours. This is according to witnesses. So later that evening, John West approaches Mcnulty outside of the cow barn holding a knife, which was never found. Mcnulty says he was holding a knife. So Mcnulty had armed himself, and he fires at West when West won't stop approaching. West is hit in the neck and runs away 25 feet and collapses and dies. Like I said, the knife was never found, but the jury found Mcnulty had fired in self-defense, and there were never any charges pressed. Mcnulty lived in Scarsdale his entire life, and he lived at 43 Fenimore Road. He had come to Scarsdale around 1867. His daughter married Chester A. Dobbs, who was Scarsdale fire chief from 1921 to 1953, and for who Dobbs Terrace is named. And his son, Charles H. Mcnulty, lived in Scarsdale in the same house until 1967. Mcnulty also served as town constable in 1902 and 03. And he was given a personal bequest by Emily Butler, the daughter of Charles Butler, whose farm he had worked on, of $7,000 in her will when she passed away. And here's his son, Charles Mcnulty, receiving an award for something that I can't remember. He's receiving a watch, but I don't remember what it was for. He's in the center there. So this is just a small incident. They found a man named Dennis Herlihy, who kept a boarding house in Scarsdale near the tracks of the Harlem line in Bronxville. And it was suspected that maybe he had been waylaid. Some of his money was missing, but no one was ever apprehended. So I'm just kind of going through some of the smaller crimes here, or crimes that were never solved, just to kind of show how crime was progressing as we move forward in time here, and Scarsdale becomes more populated. Now, this was more of a white collar crime. Edwin J. Dunning and William Bailey Lang. William Lang built Rousley, which is the house that is now the Scarsdale Women's Club, in 1858. It was modeled after an estate in England that he admired, and he was actually involved in building a lot of interesting architecture, not just in Scarsdale. He was an iron merchant in Boston and New York City, and he died in 1887, and he's buried at St. James the Less in Scarsdale. Dunning, who married his daughter, was a financier in New York City and Boston, and he married Frances Gore Lang, his daughter, William Bailey Lang's daughter. So in 1878, there was some trouble with his business. It seemed he'd used some money from investors for personal loans or collateral. And nothing really happens, though, until 1886, when he's indicted for larceny. He runs off to his estate in Saranac Lake with, he's married to Frances at this time. He's arrested in Saranac, gives bail, and runs off again. And then he's found in his apartment in New York City, which was owned by Frances Dunning. And it appears that he was able to hide a lot of his money under her name. So you can see here from the New York Times, he's lived like a prince and had a summer home at Scarsdale as well as at Saranac Lake. All his property is in the name of his wife, and for that reason, creditors were never able to collect judgments against him. But he wasn't done. Apparently, he escaped or served time and then continued, uninterrupted, basically. He moved to Boston and set up shop there. And then he was also arrested in Boston for basically doing the same thing. And this is, of course, just speculation, but Lang died in 1887. And Barbara McDonald and I have talked about this, that, all of these affairs with Dunning and his daughter maybe had, especially after Lang's wife died, been the last nail, could have been the last nail in the coffin. But on a more positive note, their daughter, Frances, and Dunning's daughter, was Emily Barringer. She was the first female ambulance surgeon and the first woman to secure a surgical residency. So here's Lang's gravestone in St. James the Less, and here's a picture of their daughter, who at least made something of the life they gave her. So here's a story of two burglars. Two people in the waiting room. Hold on. I have to admit people. Okay. I don't see anything in the chat yet, so I'm guessing there are no questions. So there was a Scarsdale station robbery in February 4th of 1888. For some reason, the stations along the railroad were targets for thieves and bandits. I guess they were easy targets. So you'll see a theme of that as we go along. So Scarsdale Station was robbed. Articles owned by station master George Ullman, who's pictured here, were taken. But these two individuals were seen leaving Scarsdale by a conductor, and they were eventually arrested. Edward Winters of Peekskill and Ellsworth Irving of Yonkers. Irving was 29 and Winters was 19, and they'd been working together as a pair for about a year. They'd been breaking into railroad stations, house break-ins, forgeries. Irving had done time in Sing Sing for burglary. And Irving's father was actually at one time police commissioner of Yonkers and a county judge. Let me see, did I have any notes for this page? Just the article. All right. So now I'm just going to go through a bunch of crimes here that sort of illustrate how Scarsdale was becoming more of a target for crime. This one is really interesting to me because this is 1892. And this woman, Amanda Purdy, was attacked as she had gotten off at the Scarsdale station and was walking to Greenville. So she must have been walking up that hill, and she passed into some woods. She says she passed up a hill and then followed the road into some woods. And in the woods, she was assaulted by a man in a slouch hat and a black suit, who caught her around the waist and threw her to the ground. He caught her by the throat and began choking her, and then he took her gold watch and chain and a sum of money. She went back to the depot and went home, but I don't believe the assailant was ever found. So it just paints an interesting picture in my mind of this woman getting off at the station. It was in the evening. at 7 o'clock last evening, right? So it was in the evening. She's walking by herself through the woods to go see her son, who was having a play date, basically, in Greenville. So and she was robbed on the way. So I guess she must have felt pretty safe to try to make that trip. And then moving on, this is 1892. James Murphy, a teamster for the Dahlman Stock Farm in Scarsdale, was on his way home from White Plains, drunk, they make sure to mention, when he was pulled from his wagon and robbed of his month's pay. And this was on the New York Post Road. The highwaymen escaped across the fields. We have more burglars in 1895. The homes of B.W. Tone and L.V. Stone were robbed. $2,000 worth of silverware, jewelry, clothing. Later, a bundle containing all the goods stolen from Mr. Tone was found later on the premises of Charles Butler. Somehow, so they had dropped their loot for whatever reason. Another article mentions that the same thieves also hit the home of Colonel Crane, that being now the Trinity Lutheran Church. They did catch the thieves this time. They found Thomas McElroy lying drunk in the road with several stolen pieces of stolen silverware. He led them to a barn on the Popham estate where they found 3 bags of silverware, 2 overcoats, 2 pairs of shoes, and 2 umbrellas. And he implicated 2 other people. So there's another, may have been the same thieves who, because it's still 1895, who tried to rob the home of Mr. Sedgwick. So this was his parents' home in Scarsdale. So Mr. Cedric and his fiancee, Miss Beals, were visiting, and in the middle of the night, about 4 o'clock in the morning, she was awakened she heard voices outside her door, and then it was opened, and a lighted candle was held up by the 2 men. And then they ran off. The man arrested first took a place with a farmer in the region and directed and discovered the houses in the neighborhood that would prove the most profitable fields. So they had been scouting the area. And they journeyed up to Scarsdale on the train. 3 of the 4 houses had been entered, and they'd been about to return back to New York when their plans were foiled by her. So it's a familiar pattern, you know, people using the railway to get to Scarsdale and leave quickly. Here in 1900, we see that Scarsdale and Hartsdale stations were robbed. They pried open the window of the Scarsdale station and carried away money from the ticket drawer. And they did the same thing in Hartsdale. And then we get to, in 1902, the holdup at the Scarsdale station of Frank Van Hosen, who was shot by his assailants and survived. And I have more on that later. But this is when people really started to get upset in Scarsdale and felt like they needed to do something about the crime that was happening. So there was a meeting held. There was a meeting held in Scarsdale about this robbery, and also it had been reported that robbers had cut telephone poles, telephone wires, and telegraph wires to shut down communication. Although maybe the wires, if the wires were copper, they may have just been stealing the wires to sell the metal. But it says here, the wealthy residents have equipped themselves with firearms and employed watchmen to guard their places, while the commuters have organized a lantern brigade. When they return to Scarsdale from their business in the city these nights, they may be seen carrying lanterns to their homes, for the village is not lighted around the station yet. So they hadn't installed lights. Here, a home was being built by Madame Aubry, and there were some thieves who stole a bunch of saws and a wagon full of carpenter tools. Now we're in Bronxville. There was a man Henry Fantilillo, who worked at the home of Henry Hall in Lawrence Park in Bronxville, was attacked by 5 highwaymen and refused to give up his money. So they stabbed him, and he fought them, and he was stabbed multiple times. And actually, I think he survived, but his gold watch was taken and some money. Here's another article about Scarsdale's residents trying to protect themselves. This one has more of a condescending is not the right word, more of a mocking tone to it. It says, millionaire constables is the order of the day in Westchester County these days, when the festive burglar is rampant and the police inefficient. Sheriff Miller has swelled the pride of many of the millionaire residents of Scarsdale by swearing them in as an auxiliary thief-taking force. And now Scarsdale and the territory immediately in the vicinity is under the protection of formidable funds and stalwart and enthusiastic constables of financial and social standing. So Scarsdale did not have a police force yet. I think it was around this time they may have started hiring watchmen, but there was still no police force. But Scarsdale was thoroughly aroused, as we can see here. This is more about how they're trying to organize. They put out a reward for the capture of the assailants who shot the station agent and Hosen. I think it's $1,000 they offered. It says $500 here, but 10 deputy sheriffs were named from those present at the meeting. So this is talking about the same meeting that the Sun was mocking here. The World, I mean. This is the New York Daily Tribune, though, taking a less mocking approach. And here, this was actually the West Mount Vernon station, but it refers down at the bottom to how there have been, this is the 4th robbery on the Harlem Railroad within a few weeks. 3 times the Scarsdale station has been looted, and the agent was held up, shot, and robbed on another occasion. This is not a station, but this Frank Andolph, who worked for a bakery in Yonkers, says that while he was driving through Scarsdale on Post Road between White Plains and Scarsdale, he was held up by a bunch of masked men who told him to never come back with his baked goods. So he said what he said is that he was basically being told not to compete with whatever bakery these men may have been from. But no one was ever caught for that, so who knows. But again, another holdup on the Post Road in Scarsdale. Here's another body that was found, placed on the tracks that they thought was robbed, that the police suspect had been robbed and placed there to make it look like a person hit by a train. That was 1906. Here in 1907, we have burglars who were posing as New York real estate promoters who entered the home of L.W. Churchill a wealthy New York lawyer in Scarsdale when the family was at dinner and stole diamonds and other jewelry valued at $2,000. In the morning, they'd visited several places in a red automobile in the neighborhood looking for lots for sale and incidentally inquiring about whether Mr. and Mrs. Churchill were at home. So they were scouting out the area. Here in 1907 again, there was a T.S. Hammond's house had been broken into. This one is kind of amusing because they didn't take a lot of the money that was there, but they did steal his overcoat, 2 derby hats, and his suspenders. Not really sure why they didn't take the pants, but they took the suspenders. So they left a bunch of money that there was actually money in the pants. So very strange. Here's the Cedric home again. If you remember, Mrs. Beals had foiled a robbery there a few years ago, and she wasn't around this time, so they stole about $500 worth of goods. I have a question. If they found the robbers, what happened to them? Did they say who the robbers are? Most of these robbers were not found. There were the 2 that I mentioned from 1895 who'd been caught. And then the other man who was found lying drunk in the road who had been caught. So if they are caught, I guess they probably went to jail. A lot of criminals from that time were sent to Sing Sing. So now we're in 1908, and again, the community was up in arms about getting some police protection. So wealthy residents of Scarsdale and Hartsdale gathered in the Scarsdale Town Hall last night to take action to protect the villagers against highwaymen and robbers who have been operating in that section. Scarsdale has no police force, and it was decided to establish a constabulary corps to patrol the highways. And it is also the intention of the villagers to appeal to the legislature to allow the village to form a police force. And I don't know why they keep using this term thoroughly aroused. I guess but here it is again. It was 1902, and now again, wealthy Westchester residents are thoroughly aroused over thefts. And I'm going to talk more about the police, but first, speeding, because this was another reason that the police, that the area needed more police. Automobiles obviously were a thing, and there were a lot of wealthy residents who had automobiles now. So this is 1905. The highway commissioners are getting busy on the automobile nuisance. Each of them is to be appointed a deputy sheriff so they may have full power to enforce the law, and 3 men will be placed on each of 3 stretches of road in the town where the autos are fond of speeding. When did Scarsdale have a police department? 1907 to 1908 is a little bit unclear. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. So here is the earliest example I could find of a speed trap. Deputy Sheriff Edward Townsend, in company with constables and timers, stopped the speeding autoists from racing through the town. This was in Hartsdale on Central Avenue, I believe. And a space of 1/8 of a mile long had been measured, and at one end stood the timers, while at the other end stood Deputy Sheriff Townsend and his assistants. If an auto was going faster than the law allows, 20 miles an hour, the timers flagged the machines, and thus the fun would begin. And here, a couple weeks later, 4 speeding chauffeurs had been arrested on Post Road for exceeding the speed limit. And here's Judge Hauschild and his corps of assistants on the job to apparently issue the arrest warrants at the spot of the crime. 20-mile-per-hour speed limit on Central Avenue, I know. Well, it was, cars didn't go quite as fast as they do now. So here's an interesting incident in 1906. The big red automobile of United States Senator Chauncey M. Depew was held up Thursday afternoon at Hartsdale, and the chauffeur was arrested for speeding. So this was a pretty big, I mean, he was a US senator who was given a speeding ticket here. And then that was in Hartsdale. And then interestingly, in November of the same year, the Judge Joseph Glover of Greenburgh, who had issued the tickets to Senator Depew and his wife in the car, or their chauffeur, was also pulled over for speeding. Or his chauffeur was, it was always their chauffeurs. They were not driving, but he was pulled over for exceeding the speed limit in the town of Greenburgh. And he also tries cases of the speeders who were caught in Hartsdale. He's collected about $1,100 from speeders, but in this case, he was taken to the police station where Judge Taylor was apparently amused by his presence there, but let him off the hook. And here's just another, unfortunately, some of these microfilm was scratched for some of these years, but you see here, 7 motorists who were going 5 to 15 miles over the speed limit. So you could get pulled over for going 25 miles an hour. The fines were around $10, $25, depending on your speed, I guess. Already conversations heard on the railroad line, or just around town about why are they enforcing the speed limit like this? And obviously this was a response, and part of the response was it's going to help keep the roads in good condition, all of the fines that are being paid, as well as to keep people safe from speeders. Here's a doctor, Dr. John A. Fordyce, who said he was going to report Judge Hauscheld for issuing him a ticket. He was going 27 miles per hour. He bridled up like a gamecock confronted with a hated rival, and thrusting his professional card at the daring justice, declared that it was a snap judgment and that the car was incapable of making the speeds accredited to it by the timers. So here's another doctor, Dr. Austin, and his chauffeur. And apparently they were accustomed to going even up to 50 miles an hour. And he said that it was sometimes necessary because he was a doctor and he had to get to his patients quickly. But the next morning, the chauffeur came down the pike at 15 miles an hour. So they listened. And then I did find a couple of warnings in the Sun, people warning readers who may be interested that that the speed regulations are being enforced in the town of Scarsdale. And here it warns motorists that travel between White Plains and Larchmont that a speed trap is being maintained on Weaver Street between these two places. So this was published in the Sun, and they had a section on for motorists, with motorists warning fellow motorists where speed laws were being enforced. So going back to the constabulary corps formed in Scarsdale in 1908, says here, Scarsdale has no police force. And it's also the intention of the villagers to appeal to the legislature to allow the village to form a police force. So it seems like there was some issue with the village had no way to fund a police force without some legislation. And we want to regress to 25-mile-per-hour speed limit, Mike says. Not sure what that's in reference to.
There's a movement to move back from 30 miles per hour to 25 to the town of Scarsdale.
Yeah, that seems pretty slow to me, but.
Well, they did it in New York City. I'm not sure how successfully.
Yeah.
It would not work very well on the post road or on Heathcote.
No, I can't imagine people going that slowly. So I couldn't find a ton. Unfortunately, we're missing Scarsdale Inquirers from the, we only have half of 1907. We don't have any of 1908, which is supposedly when the police force was formed. This article from 1929 says that the police force was established in April of 1907. I went back, because we have those issues. I went back to April of 1907, and I didn't see any mention of a police force being established in the paper at that time. So I feel like it might really be more like 1908, somewhere in 1908, or at least the second half of 1907, but we don't have those years of the Scarsdale Inquirer, unfortunately, those issues. So what this article says is that Lieutenant Steve Smith was appointed in 1907 as the first officer. It says, from a few years previous to that time, the families who lived here had no police force and no police protection because they had no need for such aid. Well, I don't know if that's true, because I just went over a bunch of crimes that happened before this, but they make it sound idyllic. They lived on friendly terms with each other. No persons from outside the community came to molest them or hurt their property, and there was no traffic problem comparable to the one existing today. And then they talk about 2 burglaries that occurred in 1904 and 1906, though they don't say which ones they were, that alarmed the citizens. But there was no statute authorizing them to use existing funds for the purpose. So Judge Welch, Charles K. Carpenter, and Cleveland Dunn solicited funds for the salary of a policeman who was Stephen Smith, and he was appointed. Later, maintaining the force became a town responsibility, and then a village responsibility. And then they talk about Benjamin Ruggiero, who here it says in April 1907 was the village's first motorcycle policeman, appointed to patrol the roads in the vicinity and arrest speeders. And later he was made the chief of police. And then in November, it's a little inconsistent because now it talks about Stephen Smith again. In November of 1907, Stephen Smith and Henry Neighborgall were appointed patrolmen. Let's see. So thank you, Jordan. Per a report on civil service, Benjamin Ruggiero was appointed on April 21st, 1908, and Stephen Smith on November 1st, 1908. So I think they may be off by a year here, because that November 1st, 1907 is what it says here. So thank you. Yes, I think it was probably 1908. Yeah, who knows how the civil service, they do talk about civil service here, but who knows how that worked at the time. Here's a picture of Stephen Smith in 1924. And here's a picture of the Scarsdale police force circa 1915. You can see Stephen Smith here in the lower right corner. And I think this may be Benjamin Ruggiero here, second, the middle person in the back row.
I think he's sitting in front in the white hat.
You think this is him? Okay.
Yeah. And Stephen Smith's nickname was Old Bejesus.
Thank you. Yes, you can see why. He looked old in 1915 and older in 1924. This is a great photo. So here's Captain Ruggiero in the front of this parade going north on Post Road near the south entrance to the high school in 1917. And I think it's right around that time that he was in an accident on the motorcycle and retired from the police force. And I think he then opened up the repair shop that's on the corner, and maybe I'm remembering wrong, but I think he opened a repair shop that's on the corner of Post Road and Jordan, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. His accident was later. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but he was in a motorcycle accident pursuing a speeder at the corner of Popham and Post Road. And then he wound up opening a bicycle and motorcycle dealership, which is where the gas station on Post Road is today.
Yeah, thank you.
The police force seems to have grown significantly based on that picture now.
Yeah, I don't, so according to this article, by 1929, maybe it's elsewhere in the article, it does talk about, let me see if I have a link to the full article here. Let's see. No, I didn't include it. But it does seem, this may not have been the entire force in 1915. It could have just been some members. I don't really have a list of the entire force.
Did you by any chance ask the police, stay at the police station if they have history of the growth of their force or any of the data like that?
You know, I didn't even think to do that. That's a good idea. I was just looking at the records I could find online. Probably a blinder that I have being, having grown up with the internet. Sometimes you forget you can just make a phone call. But I don't know if the police have records going back that far. You know, and something that someone could do is we have the police blotters from the time period. They're being held now at the Westchester County Archives or the Westchester Historical Society. Where was the police station? Jordan says there were 6 cops in 1916. And Leslie says we have photos in the Scarsdale Historical Society film on Arthur Manor. I don't know where the police station was. I think it was at Village Hall, but I'm not sure.
Village Hall then would have been by Fenimore Road,
Yeah.
not where Village Hall is now.
Right, the first Village Hall, yeah.
It's possible that they also had auxiliary police like we have volunteer firemen today. In terms of the photo of the larger number in 17.
Maybe. That, yeah, the entire fire department was auxiliary at the time. Let's see. So moving on, this was a sensational case. This was the murder of the Scarsdale station master Herbert Fellows in 1899. He was the station agent and postmaster. His wife was Minnie and his son Ray Fellows. Minnie later took over the role of postmaster in the village, and he lived on the boulevard near Scarsdale Avenue. He was killed by a 19-year-old Edgar Burns, who lived in Arthur Manor on Wilmot Road, a confirmed cigarette fiend who tried to use an insanity defense. So what happened was that Burns was hanging out at the station with Fellows. They knew each other, and they often would walk home in the same direction together. So they were headed back from the station around 9 p.m. walking together, and Burns describes how he was overtaken with an uncontrollable desire to shoot Fellows in the back of the head and steal the money that he knew he had because he'd been at the station with him. This is a picture from the New York Journal of, or a drawing, a sketch of Fellows. Burns was found guilty. This is a sketch of Burns. and sentenced to life in Sing Sing. But he was apparently converted by the Salvation Army while he was a prisoner and later became an Episcopal minister. But what's interesting is, let's see, and thank you, Jordan. Some of this Jordan had in a previous presentation, so I took a couple of the articles and images from that. So let's see, here, someone testifying that he'd appeared rational to combat the insanity defense. This is after Burns was convicted. He says to his guard, and this is part of an article, by the way, where there was a prison break at the prison where he was being held that he didn't participate in. And in that same article, they quote him, "I knew I would not be electrocuted," he remarked. "I felt sure of going to Sing Sing or the state insane asylum. It doesn't make any difference to me. I am contented. I believe that I may yet be sent to an insane asylum. If I am not, my relatives may get a pardon for me within 10 years. Yeah, I believe they did have capital punishment back then. Let's see. Young Burns appeared very happy tonight. He sang several comic songs, smoked cigarettes, which was a theme of the trial, by the way, that he was a cigarette fiend, and that he had headaches, and, you know, there was just generally a bad person, a bad boy. He wished to be taken to Sing Sing immediately. So, interestingly enough, this is his draft registration card. He's 38 years old, and he was born in 1880. So 90, 10, 1918. And he says he's a religious worker. And he's clearly out of prison by that point. So he was convicted in 1901. He's out of prison by 1918 at the latest. And later in his life, no one seemed to know that he'd been in prison. His story was that he had been teaching printing to prisoners in Sing Sing. And that's when he decided to go into the ministry. He was ordained in 1920. You can see also here in this article from the Chapel of Christ the King in North Carolina, that before World War I, he was a mission worker for the National Bible Institute on the slum streets of New York City. He also taught printing at Sing Sing prison in New York. So clearly he had lied about his past. And here's a picture of him from Find a Grave that one of his relatives posted. So it's interesting. He lived a long life after this, and he seems to have reformed, unless he committed crimes that we don't know about, but he left his past behind. This is White Plains, but it was in 1902, this woman, Isabella Allen, was found murdered. At first, a Black man, they called him colored, but Frank Boyd was indicted and put on trial, and he was actually acquitted, because later we get this article from the Scarsdale Inquirer where Nesbitt, let me see if, George Nesbitt confesses on July 17th to that he struck this woman, Mrs. Margaret Kelly, with a handkerchief loaded with stones and then robbed her house. But he implicates Frank Boyd, who was acquitted of her murder, as an accessory. So I don't know what happened to Frank Boyd after this. He'd already been tried, so I guess he can't be tried again, maybe, I don't know, but there's no mention of it after that. Go back to, oh yeah, here's some images of the articles. Frank Boyd indicted, and then George Nesbitt confessing. Just going into more detail about Frank Van Hosen, who was assaulted and shot, the Scarsdale station agent that we sort of talked about a little bit before. Here's his tombstone. So he hadn't been there very long. He had come down from Philmont, which is up in Columbia County, I believe, to work at the station. Unfortunately, he was, two men came around the south end of the station with red handkerchiefs over their faces and threatened to shoot him. He held up his hands and told them not to shoot, take everything. They hit him in the head and fired 4 shots, hit him in his left leg. The recent highway robbery at Scarsdale Station attracts attention to the fact that Scarsdale is the first station, except Yonkers Park, out of New York City, that is not in some way protected against such criminals as those who attacked him. And then here's some more articles about how Scarsdale needs more protection beyond what they had at the time. Although we have 4 constables and 4 justices, nothing was done. We don't blame them. Fault lays with the system. We need some kind of a night patrol. There was a town board meeting. So we talked about, I think I talked about this a little bit before. This was the meeting where the millionaires were constableized. What's the right term? But you can see that there was actually a petition inviting people to come. Alexander Crane signed it. The elder Angel, HHB Angel, who's a prominent real estate agent, and his son also in Scarsdale. 75 of the voters turned out, and $500 was raised for the arrest and conviction of the man who shot Van Hosen. And I found, I couldn't find much about Van Hosen, but I did find his registration card for the draft here. So he was born in 1878. And he lived in upstate New York for most of his life. It says he's a farmer here. So this was after his stint as a station master. Is there any difference between a constable and a police officer? A constable is appointed by a judge, I think, or by there's definitely a difference. I'm not clear exactly what it is, but I really should have looked that up. Let me see. What is a constable? A peace officer with limited policing authority, typically in a small town. So here's the killing of the coachman, James McKeen. He was the coachman for Mr. Edward Graves of Fort Hill, Greenville, found dead in his bed on June 27th, 1906. He was resting on his bed. He had one hand under his head and the other on his stomach, feet crossed as if he had just laid down to take a rest. The gun found near the foot of the bed was an old-fashioned muzzle loader belonging to former employee Edward Barry. who was then suspected because it was his gun. He lived nearby and he had been heard threatening to shoot some of the neighbors. So he clearly wasn't a very friendly guy. But it turns out it was actually Edward Quinn, 16-year-old boy who worked as a stable hand, who had first had said he'd found the body, but he had actually gone to McKeen's room with a message to get his work done. McKeen was laying down and said he was in no hurry. So Quinn picked up the gun and began fooling with it. McKeen told him the gun was no good. Quinn pulled back the hammer and pulled the trigger, and of course it fired and blew McKeen's head off. So it was supposedly an accident, and Quinn eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter. I must move to a diamond applicant now in twilight of our democracy. Okay, thanks, Mike. So here's the article from the Scarsdale Inquirer. And here was Quinn's initial statement about how he opened the door and saw his head crushed in and ran and told the cook and chambermaid. And then for whatever reason, he spent a night in jail, I guess because I don't really know why, but the police officer, the sheriff, told Quinn that, if he knew anything more about the murder, he should tell him. But I don't know if he was expecting him to confess. Maybe he thought he just knew something else, but he then gave a confession. I tried to find out what happened to him afterwards. I couldn't find. I even went and looked at the Sing Sing records for prisoners who were taken in 1906 and 1907. 1907 is missing. So I don't know what it is about that year, but there were no records. So the runaway servant in 1906, Veronica, a stolid peasant girl from Italy, as she's described, was employed by H.G. Kerr as a nurse. She was 15 years old. And apparently there were disputes about money. Kerr says he was told to send the money directly to the father in Italy, so he'd been holding on to it and not paying Veronica directly. And Veronica wanted her money. She didn't want to return to Italy. She wanted to stay in the United States, and so she ran off. And she found some lawyers in White Plains who were willing to help her try to get the money. But Kerr apparently had a temper and assaulted one or two of these lawyers. So, fist fight in lawyer's office. H.C. Kerr struck attorney Hughes on the jaw, was arrested. Judge Mercer imposes fine for assault on Joseph Eudes. So these were two attorneys. The attorney here was John J. Hughes. Yeah, I don't know what happened to the girl, Leslie. It was never really, I couldn't find anything about her. I'm guessing she stayed in the United States, though. So Kerr writes this long-winded article to the Inquirer explaining his position. And at the end, let's see. First of all, he says that she was a terrible nurse and that he agreed to take her along with, let's see. Or what her brother, okay. So she assumed little care of my child and absolutely no responsibility. Her father and mother were willing that she should come to this country with my family upon our solemn promise that we would see her safe on a steamer bound for Italy if she ever left our home, for they did not wish her to be adrift alone in the United States. The girl was brought to this country at a cost to me of $100, for which she was never charged. She was never charged with doctor's bills, medicine. So basically he's saying, look, I took care of her. She was useless. I was doing them a favor. And now she ran off and wants my money and these lawyers are what they're saying is offensive to me. So far as the pending charge of assault upon the attorney who represents the girl is concerned, I wish to state that I received an insulting letter from this lawyer in White Plains in which he invited me to call at his office. I responded to this request and denounced the letter and the writer, as I believed and still believe I was justified in doing. Others, businessmen and lawyers who have seen the letter, have manifested their utmost contempt for it and have not found language strong enough in denouncing it as a gross insult. An attempt was made at this attorney's office to force me from the room, and it was during this attempt that the attorney alleges the assault took place. So then the lawyers are suing him, and he's suing the lawyers, and there's no clear end to it in the papers, but in one article, it's described that he pistol whipped one of the or horse whipped one of the lawyers. So I think this is the last one. It's getting kind of late. The Lockwood Collegiate School was located at Heathcote Hall in Scarsdale, a boarding school for girls. And it was run by the Lockwood sisters. It was the Adams House or Heathcote Hall from 1901 to 1907. Then they built a new building on the corner that they purchased land from Colonel Crane, and the land extended from Popham Road south beyond the present Lockwood Road, and from the vicinity of Church Lane almost to the present Heathcote Inn Apartments. And it's now the it's now the music school. Here's the progression was Lockwood Collegiate School, the Scarsdale Lodge, the Scarsdale Inn, and then Hoff-Barthelson Music School. So this man, Bert Curtis, decided he was going to go into the school and he stole some jewelry from the dorm rooms of these two students. He was later identified, he was arrested by the NYPD, and Miss Lockwood and two students identified him. He was apparently a well-known sneak thief and was convicted in 1907, but the jewelry was never recovered. And here you get a little description of how brave the Lockwood schoolgirls were. Never in many long years of court experience has the writer seen such unassailable witnesses as the Lockwood schoolgirls were. Trying as the ordeal must have been to each and all of them, when they were made the target of legal crossfire, not one of them faltered. Every question put to each of these young ladies received a prompt, unstudied reply, and all the time the eyes of those little ladies looked directly into those of the examiner, without the flutter of an eyelash. And it was apparently kind of a big trial. There were a lot of people from Scarsdale and surrounding communities who went to the trial. Here's a picture of the school then and now. I left this on here because I'd started to do some research on it, on the Black Hand. There were definitely some murders in the area that were attributed to this sect, kind of a group of a mafia, group. There was a hotel keeper who was stabbed in 1905, and the assailants were thought to be members of this group. There was a murder of Frank Frabozio, I don't know how to say that, found in Bronxville with several stab wounds. The murder of Felipe Carrito, found in a manhole of the Bronx River Valley sewer near Bronx Street and Hopkins Avenue in White Plains. And here's an article from the New York Times in 1913 about Sheriff William Doyle of Westchester County, who's been working to find the members of this gang that have been operating in Westchester. He says that he believes that the leaders of the band were terrorizing the Italian colonies of his county. That the gang operating in White Plains was a branch of an organized band which reached to all the larger cities of the East, Middle West, and even into Canada. So it's a big syndicate. White Plains, and for that matter, other sections of Westchester County have been terrorized by this gang, said the sheriff, but now I believe we have the guilty men. There was apparently a feud within the gang that led to a lot of these killings. 19-year-old Pietro Rabacci was actually executed in 1914 by electric chair. He had confessed to some of the murders. So here's from the Scarsdale Inquirer on March 7th, 1914. It said that the whole story of the Italian vendetta from the time Tony Morrow and Raphael Bova quarreled has been told of Morrow's brother, the dynamiting of Mary Fidel's home in Bronx Street, 2 different attempts on the life of Tony Morrow, the murder of Carita, in the fight for possession of a girl in a house in Bronx Street in February of 1912. So there was talk about how the Black Hand or whatever this group was running some sort of a human trafficking, basically, in Italian women immigrants. So thank you. I hope this was interesting. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions or comments or anything.
Dan, as you looked, did you see stuff about the early era, about like crimes that sort of aren't crimes anymore? People arrested for either loitering or just kind of not belonging and stuff like that here?
Yeah, well, what jumps to mind is that there were reports of horse racing being shut down on Sundays. And there was another horse racing and one other thing, but basically, not allowing those kind of things on Sundays. In terms of loitering, not really in Scarsdale. Not that I can remember. Anyone else? Okay, well, I'm tired. I hope it was interesting. I spent a lot of time doing this research and I never really felt like I was done or had a finished product. So, but I've already been working on it. I'd been working on it for 2 months at least already. So this is where I had gotten at this point. But I hope I pulled out some events you hadn't heard of. Because I know I could have gone a different direction with this and looked at some of the more recent crimes that are more well known, like Tarnower and that kind of thing. But I wanted to kind of dig a little farther back if I could, and just kind of unearth some stuff from long ago. Thank you, everyone.
Fine, thanks.
Dan,
Very nice evening.
fun.
Have a good night.
Yeah.
Good night. Good night. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.